Okay, we're back on, and we were talking about All in the Family. How hands-on was Norman Lear on All in the Family?
Oh, very hands-on. What I had to learn too, along with the innovation that I told you about, improvising and so on and so forth and so on. At the end, we would read the script on the first day. That afternoon, if there was time, depending on changes that the writers would want to make and everything, and we sat around a big table. And I don't think Norman was there. The writers were there, the cast was there, I was there. In the afternoon, we'd have lunch brought in, and then in the afternoon, I would begin to block. But we didn't work past 5 o'clock or 6, and if I didn't finish blocking, I would block the next day. And that night, the writers would have pink-paged any changes we had talked about at the table, right? So we'd start in the morning by incorporating all the changes and so on and so forth, and I would finish blocking it. And assuming there wasn't that much, I'd get it blocked. The whole thing was a half hour, and in the afternoon, we'd do a run-through, and so forth. Then the next day, we would come back, do a run-through in the morning. Oh, more changes if there were changes. And then that afternoon, the network and Norman would come in and watch a run-through. They would come in, this was in a rehearsal hall, and they'd watch a run-through. Then we would sit down in a big circle, and everybody and anybody could comment. Norman, the writers, the cast, me. In other words, so you're asking, he was involved to that extent. And any decisions that had to be made, he would have to okay them and justify them. So he was very involved. And of course, he had, as I said earlier, he had 2 or 3 other shows on the air at the same time. So he was spread pretty thin. Tandem Productions was very successful.
When Carol O'Connor came back, was he humbled in any way from being gone, or
was he humbled? Are you kidding me? Not Carol. I will say something about Carol. And the man is now gone, and I thought, as Archie, he was marvelous. The only problem I felt about Carol was that Carol had made Archie Bunker, right? He'd made the character and made it work, and for all the years it was on. What Carol would never admit was that Archie Bunker made Carol, because up to then, Carol was a competent and a very talented character man, and that was all. And had All in the Family not come along, he would have continued to do feature pictures in smaller parts, or a series as a guest, and so on and so forth. But he'd have never been the star that he was. Archie Bunker made Carol O'Connor, and he would never admit that. That was the only thing about that.
And how long were you on the show? How many episodes did you do?
I did 20. Well, at that time, the network was doing, it was a 20. We did 13. How many did we do? We did 13 or 14, because in the summer they do reruns, which was great because they rerun the whole season, and they never did. 26 was a half a year, right? I'd take it back. We did 24 or so. The network always allowed for emergencies, news shows and things where it would get canceled. So they never did 26, but they did 24 or so, and I did a whole season. Then they'd run those all back, and needless to say, I got paid full price for the whole summer season, so forth. But I did 1 year.
Did you work with Henry Fonda on that one show that he did the
No,
best
that
of?
was done, John Rich did that. Mm-hmm. I think maybe I did as an honor show, yes. Something I have to admit it. I'm sorry, Gary. It's been a long time, and I've forgotten.
Okay, and now the Jeffersons pilot appeared as
I
an
did-
episode of All in the Family.
That appeared as an episode, yes, as one of the episodes. But I did the pilot for that, yes. And would have probably done the series, but I was tied up, so.
And what was was it difficult to basically, they knew it was going to be a pilot when you were doing it?
Oh, yes.
So they
absolutely.
created the whole set that you would see later on in the
Absolutely.
show?
They create, and the characters that, the secondary characters, there was an intermarriage there. The English actor and the African American lady was a married couple, and then there was the other character, I forget, but all the secondary characters. Oh, and the gal that played the maid, who ended up with a series of her own, also African American. But yes, they knew it was going to be a pilot, definitely. And what they did it as a pilot, as an episode of All in the Family, but the network made the decision that it would become a series of its own.
And how did you come to leave All in the Family?
Yeah, a combination. I didn't want to do sitcoms forever, and at that point in time, Bill Bell made me the offer about Young and Restless.
And what do you think is the legacy of All in the Family?
What is the legacy?
Yeah.
To what extent? How it I think it, again, it's almost like what I said about at the interview of Days of Our Lives. I think that's an extension of what I said, in that it opened up attitudes for what the public would accept and could accept, in terms of bigotry and everything. But of course, it was written in such a way that Archie was always the buffoon. He was bigoted and the whole thing, and Edith compensated, and he and Meathead went round and round, and he and Sally went round and round to some degree. And but as far as his attitude, whenever he would pull off something that was so stupid, he always ended up being the goat without realizing it. I mean, that was his way of life, down to the bar to drink with the guys and so forth. And there were times that Edith won points, but not very often. She was very forgiving and very loving and so forth. And of course, Carol, in all due respect, had the capability emotionally of playing anything. When Sally, did she lose the baby or didn't she? Yeah. When she was pregnant and then lost the baby, I think, it was one of the warmest scenes that have ever been done, because she was his little girl. And he was capable of playing that kind of emotion, He was a good actor. I never would fault him as an actor. I simply mean, though, that he would have been just another good character actor if it hadn't been for All in the Family.
Okay, so you got the call from Bill Bell, and you
I
moved
got a
on
call
to,
from Bill Bell
Young
and saying, you want to
Restless?
come back in? John Conboy's going to do a thing. And by the way, that was during a strike period, so forth. Yes, I was involved in a couple of strikes, writer strikes. I wasn't involved in that one. Anyway, John Conboy did himself a disservice and a service at the same time. From what I understand, according to him, CBS had said do anything to keep the show on the air, meaning Young and Restless, during the strike. And so what he did, knowing he was going to do Capitol, which was a Washington-based show, political, and needless to say the sets would be large and, and spectacular and so forth. He built sets, he created a story, or he guided the story, created the story on Young and Restless, which demanded sets that were enormous, big, elaborate, and the show went $2 million over budget. Now, according to him, CBS had said do anything and spend any amount of money that is necessary to keep the show on the air and he took the advantage of creating an atmosphere which would be projected on Capitol. Well, remember what I told you about when a contract ran out at the end of the year? At the end of that year, the strike had gotten settled, and Young and Restless was $2 million over budget. And they went back to Bill Bell and said, we want the $2 million. Well, Bill was furious. And he realized that John had done this deliberately. When he first called me and said, John's going to do Capitol, he was very pleasant about John, so on and so forth. By the time it was time to bring me in, when John left to do Capitol, he was bitter as the devil. I said, well, he said, all right, I've decided, I've talked to a couple of 3 people, and I'm going to bring you in as executive producer. I said, okay. By the way, you got to keep in mind, he was out here with his family and everything. Bold and Beautiful hadn't started yet. Young and Restless, he said, I don't know yet exactly. It's whenever John Conboy is going to start Capitol. So finally that got resolved, and that's when I started on the show. And came into it and loved everybody on the show. I really, Young and Restless. I wrote Bill Bell a letter after I'd left and gone. And I wrote him a letter saying, I'd already done General Hospital. And I wrote him a letter after I was retired. And I said, Bill, we'd had our disagreements, and we did, over story and things. But I said, I want you to know that the 5 years that I spent on Young and Restless were the as happy a 5 years as I've ever spent in television. New York notwithstanding, and true story, where I was my own boss, did everything I wanted to. Oh, by the way, he was still in Chicago when I started. I forgot, because he didn't actually move out here till Bold and the Beautiful was sold and bought. And so he brought me in. Ed Scott, who had been kind of operating as the producer, became my assistant. And I came in and took over.
So you were essentially running the show.
Pardon?
You were essentially running the show.
Oh, yes. Bill Bell was in Chicago and writing from there. And he had a staff. Some of his writers were out here, John Smith and a couple of the others. I think Pat Falcon Smith was writing for him at that time. In other words, he had a staff. But he was doing story in Chicago. And so I came in, and again, like I said, it wasn't until he saw Bold and Beautiful that he actually moved out here.
Did you have that same sort of relationship with the actors, with Gene Cooper and
yes,
Eric Braeden? And
more so.
That ensemble?
And in fact, I'll tell you something, an interesting little story. I would run out on the floor and talk to the actors, and they all loved me because John Conboy was an entrepreneur. He sold shows and ran shows, but he never worked with the people like I did. So I would go out and talk and everything. I got brought up on charges by the Directors Guild 3 times because, it never would come to fruition because they would have to have a hearing and my directors would have to come in and testify against me. Well, none of them would do it because what was happening, I was being turned in by some AD or production manager was walking down the hall when the doors were open, and they'd see me on the floor talking to the actors. So they would call the Directors Guild and say, he's imposing on the director's prerogative. But the directors would never come to it. So finally, I came to an agreement with the Directors Guild because they admitted to me that I'd been brought up on charges, and they admitted to me that nobody would come and testify against me. So I came to an agreement that anything I was going to say to the actors to do, I would say to the director first, and then I said, all right, if I go to, and they would say yes, and so forth. So I got along fine, and needless to say, and we, you know, in the 5 years I was there, we were nominated as Best Show for 3 years, 3 times in the 5 years, and won it every time. So,
How did Young and the Restless differ from Days of Our Lives, content-wise and just production?
well, it not not that much different. I mean, they were both well done and had good people and good directors and good design, good sets, and so forth. Completely different today, by the way. I'm glad I got out when I did because, well, they're doing 2 and 3 shows a week. I mean, you know, extra shows. So that's neither here nor there. As far as the 2 shows, there wasn't that. From my standpoint, that was one of the innovations I brought into both, particularly after they went to an hour. We introduced much more editing than we had done because what had never been done before, we began, you know, if a scene was done 3 times, what I would do would be make notes with my AD. And if there was something in the second take, if we did it 3 times, let's say, and there was something in the second take that was better than the third take, we'd pull it. So the editing room, we really would build the end product much more than we ever had before.
Were you always working with the editors in post-production, even
Yes.
like in All in the Family and shows like that?
Oh yes, All in the Family. I would do the complete editing. Well, by the way, All in the Family and the sitcoms were done. You would do a performance, like say at 6 o'clock, right, with an audience. Then you'd go to dinner, and we'd give notes. And then we would do, and that was considered, that was one of the reasons that my approach was different than John Rich's. The first performance was considered the dress rehearsal, but it was taped. And if you want to know the truth, in the 22 episodes I did and so forth, more of that first performance was used than the second one, which was considered the show. What we would do, if Norman and the writers felt there were certain lines that didn't work and so forth, they would change them. And we'd redo those and then even do pickups, but with a second audience and so forth. But my shows, most of them, and I'll tell you why, Gary, I found the second show, this cast, All the Family, they were an incredible bunch. If they had a meal on the show, they would eat it all. And then they'd go to dinner, and they would eat again. And I found what was considered the performance, which was the second show, they were waterlogged. I mean, they were, and that's why my first show was like an opening night. And that's why we ended, and I shot it well. And Norman admitted it. And so we would, and now in answer to your question, yes, the next day we would tape the show on a Friday, I think, or Saturday, it doesn't matter. The next day on a Monday, no, it was on a Friday, and on Saturday I would go in, work with the editor, and put it together. But generally, it was most of the first performance, and so on and so forth. Now, Days of Our Lives and Young and Restless, I introduced doing the same kind of thing, pulling the best of every performance we would get.
And you also then worked on General Hospital. This is now another
Same
network.
way. When I went to General Hospital, they were doing the same kind of thing, and I introduced the whole thing of shooting scenes in the same set and so on and so forth. Now, one innovation on both, Jesus, I meant to bring you that too. I was going to bring you my demo reel. Young and Restless and General Hospital were the first 2 shows. Days of Our Lives, there wasn't the budget for it. Well, it was a half hour first and then an hour, but Young and Restless and General Hospital were the first shows where we went out and did bid remotes. I mean, I shot General Hospital. Days of Our Lives, I shot in San Francisco and all over town and everything. General Hospital, I shot Niagara Falls, the Mount Rushmore. I shot all over for General Hospital. And that was always budgeted completely separately, you know. So
You were replacing Gloria Monty, or was she there?
oh, she was ready to retire. She was there 9 years or so. She was ready to retire, and the lady who died of a brain tumor, not Pat Smith, God, I can't remember her name. Jackie Smith was head of daytime at ABC. And she and I, you know what? It's a very funny thing. I don't know how the relationship started. Every time she worked out of New York, Jackie Smith, she'd come to California and we'd meet at the Playboy Club or at a bar somewhere and commiserate. And we never had worked together. So one time she came out and she said, "Listen, I'm staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Come over and have dinner with me." So I went over and had dinner. We had our wine and our hors d'oeuvres and stuff. And she says, "I want you to do General Hospital." I said, "What, are you kidding? I'm under contract to Young and Restless." She said, I know exactly when it runs out. And Gloria Monty wants to leave. And she said she would stay until we could clear you. Well, my contract ran to the end of the year. So I went to my agent and said, "Talk General Hospital." Well, the big reason I left, Gary, because what I said was true. I was very happy at Young and Restless. General Hospital doubled my salary. Well, I don't have to tell you, doubling a salary is something. I went home and Heather and I talked about it. I said, ye gods. So for 6 months, by the way, I worked under alias at Young and Restless because I knew I was going to go to General Hospital at the end of the year. But I didn't want the people at Young and Restless to feel I'd abdicated the ship, you know. So I signed a contract with ABC with another name, pseudonym, and so forth. Finally, Bill Bell found out about it and took me to lunch. He said, "I hear you're going to..." I said, "Yeah, Bill." And I told him the truth. I said, "Bill, the only reason I'm leaving is because they doubled my salary." Well, can't complain about that. And that's when I left. And but Jackie Smith died of a brain tumor before I ever did the show. Another lady named Jackie, also Jackie, can't remember, big heavy-set lady, took over. And I had dinner with her at the Century City Hotel. That's where she stayed. And because ABC had executive offices in Century City. And I went to dinner and I said, "Look, I want to tell you something right now. Jackie Smith was the one that brought me in, or wanted me to come in. She's gone. If you feel any different and you want to get somebody else, I will negate the contract. You'll have no lawsuits or anything. It's your prerogative." Because I said, I don't want to force myself on you since I was hired by somebody else. And she said, "Nope." I talked to Jackie before she got sick, and we had decided, I guess she was her assistant or something, and she said, "No, I want you to do it."
What was your general experience on General Hospital?
Not as happy as Young and Restless. You know what? Gloria Monty was a despot. She did an incredible job. She took over from a producer named Jim Young, who had done the show from its origination, and it was about to go under. And she took it over, and through story and casting and everything, she really brought it up to the top. When I took over Young and Restless, General Hospital was riding high, as you know, number one, with her. But she ran a tough ship. And she dictated everything. For instance, when I first went in there, in the offices, which were, by the way, back on the Columbia lot. You know, Columbia had moved out, and now General Hospital was at one end, Days of Our Lives was at the other. Anyway, I walked into the offices, which were below a studio, under a motion picture studio, where they were shooting the show. Mind you, we shot the show and everything there. But I walked in, and there was a writer's room, right? And there was a tape on the carpeting, and actors were not permitted to walk across that tape and talk to writers. That was Gloria. The writers and actors were not to get along. Well, the first thing I did when I brought in Ann Marcus, and that's who I brought in as head writer, I had her meet all the lead characters and everything and talk about story and everything. You know, my whole attitude was completely different. But in answer to your question about my experience, General Hospital, there seemed to be a reflection of Gloria's attitude in general. Everybody was on the defensive. Everybody, you know, they still carried that negative defensive attitude that she had installed in everybody. And I had to break that all down. In fact, one year, I don't know whether it was a year, I changed the blocking and did the scheduling like I'd done on the other shows, right? Because they had been facing the same problem. We now walked in and so forth. Well, let's take a year as an example. I called a meeting and I said, this is your Yell at Wesley Kenney night. And I set it up in a conference room, and the cast and the crew and everybody were invited. And I said, all right. And I sat on a high stool. I said, tell me what you're unhappy about, what you think, so on and so forth. And I'll never forget, a couple of the crew people and everything told me later, my God, Gloria Monty never would have, you know, she'd have died before she'd have done this. And there were some people said, well, we think this and so forth about the story. So I would answer them, and I would give them if I thought there was a reason and so forth. There was one gal, by the way, on camera. Remember, you had asked me. There was a gal on camera. Now, Gloria never cared about camera work, meaning I would see shows on the air where cameras were out of focus, and they get caught in a move, and so on and so forth. She was only concerned about performance and story, and it worked for her, right? But I felt that was important too, but I also felt the camera work should be good and right, and I had proven it on other shows. So when there was this one woman camera person, and she was a pain in the tail. But at the time, she said, well, the camera work has gone to pot because I said, whoa, wait a minute. I said, I'm open to all suggestions, but I have to tell you right now, Gloria Monty did the worst camera work of any show I've seen. It was out of focus, and there were zip pans and so forth. So don't talk to me about camera work. Well, she shut up, and my technical director, who was my TD, a really nice guy, came to me later and he says, I'm glad you said that because that was bullshit, and what you said was absolutely true. And that was one of the first things I had to do, by the way. The directors were all terrific. Alan Pulse and one of them that's still there, I can't even remember. Anyway, they were terrific directors. And I told them the same thing. And boy, they cleaned up their act like that. I worked differently with General Hospital. I sat in my office and I had a big monitor, and I would watch through the run-throughs. And then I would go down to the control room for taping and through dress rehearsal. And first of all, as executive producer on General Hospital, remember, I didn't have Bill Bell. So I really rode much tighter on the story and everything with Ann. Ann and I got along fine. but I worked closer with the story and the writing than I ever had on the other shows. But so anyway, but it was never as happy a relationship as I'd had on Young and Restless.
There was a show you did called Miss Klein, We Love You for ABC Afternoon Pay Break. And you you won an Emmy for that. And you also won Emmys for the daytime
That's
shows.
right.
What was your experience like with the daytime
Well, it's
Emmys?
interesting that Columbia Pictures asked me to do that with Patty Duke and her husband, John
Aston?
Huh?
John Aston?
Yeah, John Aston. And her agreement was that she would do it if they would use him on it too. And it was a hospital story. And she was a nurse, she was a teacher. They came in to teach these kids and discovered they were all terminal. And that was why, she couldn't get any reaction or anything out of them. And so John Aston was the head of the hospital. And so I rehearsed for 2 or 3 days, and we shot that. And John, very congenial guy, but not a great actor. And on a show like this, we would rehearse a scene. I'll tell you a funny story. We would rehearse a scene, and now we're into about the 3rd day, and all the actors have learned their lines, and we're doing run-throughs. We're ready to do the show. And we were going to tape it for 2 days. It was an hour show. And Patty had had a scene with John in his office. And he sat on the front of it, and I think it's where he explained to her why she couldn't get any reaction. And so he rehearsed this scene, and it was just flat. It was nothing, right? And she's sitting there in a chair, never forget. And I said, John, what happened to all the values we talked about? And, your concern about her and the kids and all this. I don't remember exactly what I said, but in that tone, I said, it wasn't there. And he sat there, and she's sitting there, and he says, Wes? I said, yeah. He said, in this scene, you told me I'd be eating a sandwich. It was my lunch. And I said, yeah. He said, when I get that sandwich, the whole thing will come into focus. And I have to tell you, Gary, I didn't know whether he was kidding or he was serious. She got up out of the chair and walked away laughing. She couldn't believe it. I said, well, John, if I'd known that, I would have had you eating that sandwich from the first day of rehearsal. So I'll never forget that story. So anyway, okay, my only conflict with her. We get into the studio, and now we're shooting. And I don't think it was that scene. It was another scene where he had a scene in his office, and he had done it. And I got home that day. We shot the whole day, and we finished. And I got home that night, and I thought, God, it just wasn't right, that she was terrific, the kids were terrific. In fact, the best scene he ever did was with one of the kids. But anyway, and I thought, God, I can't let that happen. So I called my art director, and I said, is that set? He said, no, it's gone. He said, I'll tell you what I can do. He says, I can give you the flat behind it and the desk. And if you want to do it single camera, do it over. So I went in the next day, and I said, John, and I was very candid with him, and he was very outgoing about things like this. I said, I want you to do that scene. Patty will sit here, and you do, and I'm only going to shoot you because the set's gone. So we redid the scene, right? And he did. I don't mean he was brilliant, but he was good. He did the scene right. When he was given some instructions and everything, he'd do it. So now we set up for the next setup, and she's in it. And I said to my stage manager, okay, tell Patty we're ready, so forth. He came back, he said, she won't come out of the dressing room. I said, why? She said, she's upset because of what you just did with the scene with him, and you didn't shoot her. So I went into the dressing room, and he's standing there because they were married and they had the same dress. It was trailer, I think. I don't remember anyway. I went in and I said, Patty, come on, She said, no, that's not fair. You didn't give me a chance to improve my scene. I said, I'm going to tell you the truth. You were terrific. I've got that. I don't need you. It was John, and he had to be better, and he was better. But I said, for God's sakes, you didn't have to do the scene over and so forth. And I said, now come on, I'm going to go out on the stage, and I hope you'll come. And about 5 minutes later, out she came, and I never had another word with her. And we did it, and the whole show, this little girl, John had one scene sitting on a bench where he had to tell her, and she's Doug Davidson's wife, who's on Young and Restless. And I'd worked with her, and she was a kid at that time. She was about 13 or 14, right? And John had to tell her she was going to lose her leg. And this kid broke down and got hysterical. It's the best scene he did, because, it just pulled him right in. He did the whole thing, so forth. So anyway, we did the thing, we put it together, and like you said, my biggest regret, Gary, was that, I put myself in as a director. I wasn't producing that, another guy produced it. I put myself in as a director of a special. And my biggest regret is that I did not put her in as a lead actress on this special, because she would have won it, hands down. Not only because of who she was, because it was so good. Well, you know the story. They did the daytime presentation that year for the first time out of Radio City in the skating rink. It was in the summer. And I took, by the way, Ed Raspberry's wife. Heather was out here, and I think Kevin had been born or something. Anyway, I took Ed Raspberry's wife, who did my medical shows, and we sat in the audience. And what they did, that the week before we went back to get they were so determined that the show wouldn't run over. It was going to be live. They were so what they did, they made presentations. They awarded some of the Emmys before the show ever went on the air. And the list, we walked into the control room of Days of Our Lives, and one of my engineers said, well, you think you're pretty much something, don't you? I said, what? Well, you've already won 2 Emmys. I said, what? And in the paper, Best Director for a Series, Days of Our Lives, Best Director for a Special, Miss Klein, We Love You. And I'd won them both. What was going to be presented on the air was the Best Director of the Year. So we went to New York, and ironically, Dennis James, who I'd worked with in Dumont and then on First Impressions, made the presentation. And he read the 4 names. There was a talk show director and a game show director, and me for the other 2, right? And he said, and the winner is Wes Kenney, for Miss Klein, We Love You is the Best Director of the Year. So I went up and accepted it and everything and the whole thing. And later, I wrote the Academy, or came over, I don't remember which. I got, the Emmys, and I said to him, by what is realistic about directing, you cannot continue to do this, because there's never going to be a game show director or a talk show director win Best Director of the Year if he or she is up against a dramatic director doing a special or a series. It's just not fair. And they thought about that, and now I'm unique, and I'm the only Best Director of the Year because that's the only one. After that, they gave 4 for Best Game Show, Best Talk Show, Best Special, and Best Series. And it's rightly so. It's just not, it's a whole different ball game. I had done those others, so I knew, and it was all camera work. Oprah, guy or whoever's doing it shoots the audience, but you don't direct those people.
Okay, I just have a couple summing up questions. You went into teaching after General Hospital. Where have you been teaching?
Oh, after that, while I was working, all the time I was working, Young and Restless, I don't remember whether it was Days of Our Lives, but I know Young and Restless in General Hospital. I was teaching for the UCLA Extension School, which is a excellent organization. As a matter of fact, they sent me one year to Televisa in Mexico City to lecture to the directors and producers down there about our style of the way we do shows. All they do is they do the short stories, and so forth. Anyway, I had worked for them, and I'd done all kinds of shows. I had done directing shows, I had lectured, all kinds of shows. But their criteria is that anybody they have in their resume, the extension school, has to be working in the business, actively. And so the minute I resigned from General Hospital, which was the last show I did regularly, kept doing medical shows for Ed Rass, but as soon as I resigned from General Hospital, they said, well, Wes, we can't use you anymore. And I said, I understand that because I'm not working in the business. About 6 months or a year later, I got a call from the university and said, we want to set up a new class with multiple cameras and so forth, and we want to know if you're interested in teaching it. And they told me blah, blah, blah. And yes, I started teaching. It's been 13 years. So I found out later that I was recommended to them by the extension school. And I've done 13 years.
Okay, what in your career would you consider your proudest achievement?
Consider what?
Your proudest achievement in your career.
Well, that's a little hard to say. I'm proud of all the things I did and my years at Dumont. I would have to say probably True Story, interestingly enough, in New York for a reason. I did that show for 4 years, 52 weeks a year, where I hired the writers, edited the stories, did the casting, shot the shows live for 4 years, and met some great people. I had great actors. I think I already mentioned a number of them. Great writers, who some of them went on and did, terrific stuff. And some of those shows I was very proud of. I was proud of all the shows I've done. But that was ones where, and boy, you talk about a budget. I had a budget, and I was limited in the size of the cast, and yet, can you imagine? 4 years of 52 original stories? The ideas, and I would meet with my writers. There was a gal named Mickey Cousins, who was actually the niece of the cousins that wrote The Nation or whatever it was. Anyway, she taught writing at NYU, and she used to send me writers. And I would read their resumes and then I would buy from them. And I bought from all kinds of people, but the point of it is 4 years of 52 scripts, original scripts. Talk about having to come up with different stories and so forth. Oh, I did a story, I put, Art Mazzio was a writer in Jersey who wrote for me, who was terrific. We did one in an elevator where 4 people got on the elevator and got stuck. And they were all kinds. There was a pregnant woman. There was an old African-American lady who had a heart attack on it. I can't remember their different characters, but there was the elevator operator. So there were the 3 women and the elevator, and we did that in an elevator. A set. So we did all kinds of crazy stories like that. We created a trailer where we shot from the inside, but we had the outside with trees around it and so on and so forth. We did a lot of stuff at night because the dark covers a multitude of sins, needless to say. But I would have to say, if I would just, I'm proud of everything I did and feel that it goes back to what I said. I feel I was an average guy who got very lucky. I made a lot of mistakes. like anybody would, but things like getting Young and Restless and getting General Hospital and getting True Story from having done The Doctors, and those things, I felt very lucky, and yet I consider myself a very average guy. And
so that sort of leads into my last question is how would you like to be remembered?
An average guy who, with great luck, was able to be successful. I think that's, as much as I can say. I love people, I love actors, I love doing the dramatic shows, and so that's how I'd like to be remembered, working with terrific people, great talented people and so forth. Oh, by the way, there's one other thing. One thing we didn't mention at all. While I was doing True Story, I decided to do a play as an actor. And I've already told you early on I was a terrible actor. But I decided to do this play because to prove that working with good people, any of it had rubbed off. And I did a play called Night of the Auk. One of the actors in it was Ed Sheeran, who ended up the executive producer director of Law and Order. And anyway, the four of us, I auditioned for an actor named Ray Boyle, who had worked for me as an actor and had gone to Carnegie. And when I heard it was an Equity Library Theater, which is like a showcase, or at that time was a showcase for actors. And it was done at the Jewish YMCA Uptown. And I said to Ray, I want to come up and audition. Well, all right. So I went up, and needless to say, when I walked in, I was embarrassed because all these actors that had worked for me. What are you doing here? I'm a friend of Ray's. So I read, and the play, every character had a monologue. And he picked those because you couldn't get it. It had run on Broadway one night because Arch Oboler would not let them cut the script. Oh, Sid Lumet directed it. He had a great cast, and it ran one night because it ran way past midnight, so forth. And Kermit Bloomgarden, who had produced it, was so furious, he destroyed all the scripts except the master one, which was in his office. And his wife, who had worked for me as an actress, said, Wes, I can't ask him to take it out, but if you go up and sit in the office, you can read it. So I did. And I'm not a good actor, never was, but I read well. So when Ray gave me this monologue, as the commander-in-chief of this spaceship, which had gone to the moon long before its time, I will say Arch Oboler was ahead of his time there, and we're on our way back to Earth, celebrating the whole thing, and right in front of our eyes, nuclear war breaks out. So we don't know where to land or where to go. And gradually, it ends up that the old man, Sorrel Book, played the scientist, the old man, and the audio man is a young guy, and they represent the past and the future. And the other two characters, two of them are killed, and I jetson myself out a jet because I had remembered a story about my great-grandfather had told me about his ancestors who had come over, and the father went out to hunt, told his wife with the 4 kids, if the Indians come, do not open the door regardless. And so the Indians do come, and she refuses to open the door, but outside the door she hears this voice say, Mommy, Mommy. And she's faced with the responsibility of either letting the kid be killed or opening the door. And she chose to keep the door closed. And that was the monologue. And so when I finished, Ray said, thank you. He came into the office the next day. He said, do you really want to do this? And I said, well, yeah, I'd like to. He said, well, you gave a hell of a reading. We all cried. Anyway, so do you have time for one more story as an extension?
No, I don't think so. I think we've run out.
Oh, all right. because I wanted to tell you the thing about my reading for that Broadway show, which was so funny. Anyway, okay.
But you made it to Broadway.
I made it to Broadway to read for a Broadway show based on that. And it then exemplified a lot of what I had tell young actors. The stage man, I read against the stage manager sitting against the proscenium, smoking a cigarette with a script in his hand. And as I've said to young actors, you cannot count on any kind of a situation when you do an audition. You never know what's going to be happening. Your audition is a performance in itself, but it's not necessarily the performance you'll give in the end. And
okay, that's good advice.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for the Archive of American Television for telling us your story.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I hope it's useful to you.
Okay.
And thank you.